of true religion and justice, the safety, honor and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Please be seated. Yeah, man. Good morning, members. I just want to extend to all apologies for the delay in starting this morning. Before we go any further, Senator Janice Allen has sought the permission of the President to join us by Zoom, and I seek the consent of members. All in favor? Any against? The ayes have it. The Senate of Friday, October 1, 2021 is now called to order. Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the Senate today are the following. Ministry paper number 65 of 2021 entitled Annual Report of the National Family Planning Board for the financial year 2019-2020. Investigation Division Special Report, the use of the emergency contracting method by public bodies, 2015-2019. The Independent Commission of Investigations Report, reflecting the period of the second quarter from April to June 2021. Provisional Collection of Tax, Amendment of Schedule to Stamp Duty Act, Order 2021. Confirmation and Continuance in Force Resolution. Provisional Collection of Tax, Amendment of Schedule to the Stamp Duty Act, Order 2021, Gazette Number 23A, dated April 1, 2021. The Legal Aid Amendment Regulations, 2021. The Agricultural Loans, Societies and Approved Organizations Regulations, 2021. And its resolution. Government of Jamaica Interim Fiscal Policy Paper for the financial year 2021-2022. Jamaica First Supplementary Estimates 2021-2022. Green Paper number 1 of 2021 entitled National Population and Sustainable Development Policy 2019. Draft Program of Action. Report of the Joint Select Committee on its deliberations on the Law Reform, Zones of Special Operations, Special Security and Community Development Measures Act 2017. And for information, the report of the Internal and External Affairs Committee on a review of the Zones of Special Operations in existing communities and the Aquaculture, Inland and Marine Products and Byproducts Inspection, Licensing and Export Act 2013.
Announcements. Bills brought from the Honorable House of Representatives. Petitions. Papers. Reports from committees. Notices of motions given orally. Question and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. motions relating to sittings of the Senate, motions for leave to introduce bills, presentation of bills without leave of the Senate first obtained, public business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to add my apologies for the late start today due to some technical discussions which were taking place on the bill. Members will recall that the debate on the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act 2021 started 2 weeks ago at our sitting on that day, and it is intended to continue the debate today. Mr. President, I had opened and I had indicated that there would be amendments which would be circulated. Those were circulated by the Parliament earlier in the week. I just wanted to indicate that there will be 3 further amendments that will be put forward today. But of course, they will be circulated for clarity. Essentially, one will be the ability of the minister to exempt categories of employers from the requirement for the policy statement. This to address concerns expressed about micro-enterprises and domestic arrangements. Clause 28 will be replaced by a full duty of confidentiality as its application was deemed to be uncertain. And the very, very final amendment on page 5, which speaks to the deletion of subclause 3, which is the one which speaks to the ability to claim an award as a civil debt, that will not be deleted. It will just have the limit taken out, the words without limit taken out. So those 3 changes will be made to this. But this is the debate, Mr. President, is underway. And I therefore await your permission for the opposition to commence their start of their contribution to the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Bunting.
Mr. President, the Deputy Leader of Opposition Business, Senator Scott Motley, will lead off for the opposition in the debate.
Thank you. Senator Scott Motley.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was momentarily detained by the fact that we were still getting amendments up to this morning. We had not anticipated that after getting 5 pages of amendments circulated. But if it makes the bill a better bill, that is what we want. Mr. President, there are many persons today who are celebrating the fact that this bill is now being debated in the upper house. There are some persons who are looking on with a great deal of apprehension. But this bill has been long outstanding because there has been recognition that there was a need to do something about sexual harassment, and as it started out in the workplace, this was so commonplace. In fact, I looked at some data, and it is true that the data does not emanate from Jamaica, but it gives us some insight. And a US survey, which was conducted in 2015, revealed that 1 in 3 women, 18 to 34 years, experience being sexually harassed at work. Of the 2,235 women surveyed, 18% said that the harassment was verbal, and 44% reported unwanted touching. What is interesting, Mr. President, is that only 29% of the women took a decision to make a formal report to their employer. The International Labour Organization has formally recognized that sexual harassment at the workplace is harmful. They point out that it is a violation of the fundamental rights of workers, and it constitutes a health and safety hazard, is an issue of discrimination, an unacceptable working condition, and a form of violence, usually against female workers. It is not difficult to deduce from that the impact which it will also have on the productivity in the workplace. And when we were looking at this legislation, we were very cognizant of the harm that could be done to women. Senator Crawford, let me make it absolutely clear that I recognize that the bill is gender neutral. And even during the discussions which we had, and I remember particularly one we had at the conference center, there was a young man who did not make his contribution from the floor, but later on confided in us instances of harassment which he had experienced. The memorandum of objects and reasons points out that there is consensus that the legislation is necessary to address concerns about sexual harassment which is employment related, occurring in institutions or arising in relation to the provision of accommodation. And I think it is appropriate for me to mention here at this point that the Most Honorable Portia Simpson Miller had in fact tabled a bill in 2015. The 8th of December 2015 was when the bill was tabled. Events intervened, and in February 2016 there was a change of government. But I think that it is clear that both administrations are committed to this process. And the way in which a bill has been crafted is to empower women by providing them with a framework by which their complaints can be heard, so that they can actually go to the employer, make a complaint, and the employer is required to take some steps to correct it or to address it. I know how important this is. Just recently, an employer called me to ask me what could be done in circumstances where a senior manager was harassing several women in the organization and how to deal with it. He acknowledged that he was harassing the women. But her concern, that is the employer who called me, is what now can I do? Such a person will have no need to inquire of anybody as to what they can do, because it will be pellucid as to the steps which can be taken. At the same time, Mr. President, I must make the point that we have a cultural problem, and there's going to be need for a cultural shift. I don't know if there's one woman inside this chamber or anybody listening from outside who has not experienced some form of sexual harassment. Some sort of reference to their bodies that makes them feel defiled. Some sort of indication as to what should be done with those bodies or what they would like to do with the body that makes them feel as though they have been violated. But when you speak to men about it, they say, it's just a little joke me run. Me never serious. I don't mean any harm when I say that. I was really trying to give a compliment. And so for the Jamaican male, they will have now to rethink how they approach matters such as that. The truth of it is that it is not a new thing that women are uncomfortable in those situations. They have always been. But they have always just simply gone aside, might be told their friends, some people just shrug it off, and they've gone ahead, living with it until the next time it happens. Now, this legislation is a very subjective legislation in the sense that it focuses on how the person who is being harassed feels. It doesn't matter that the man says or the woman says, I did not intend for her to feel uncomfortable. I was just running a joke. What is important is how the person who is receiving it feels. I think that is important, but I also think that it presents some problems. I have tried to assure Senator Morris, for example, that he can still tell me that he likes my perfume. It is welcome. So he need not desist as he had feared.
Thank you.
If, however, he says something to a woman and indicates that he is seeing something about her that makes him attracted to her and makes a pass at her, therein lies the rub. After seeing her. Because the act requires that the advance be unwelcome. So the action can be of a physical nature, a demand or request for sex or favors of a sexual nature, the making of sexual suggestions, remarks, or innuendos, and clearly the showing of pornography or the display of images or objects of a sexual nature. And here we get into a little bit of controversy as we have been talking about it. Any other physical, gestural, verbal, non-verbal, or visual conduct of a sexual nature. And I can tell you, Madam Leader of Government Business, that in all the discussions that we have had with persons outside of this chamber, there's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of apprehension about how far it is going and how prescribed their actions are going to be. Perhaps, as we have been discussing on this side, there needs to be some signal sent by the woman. Or the person, I'm sorry. Thank you, Senator. It's so challenging to remember that it is gender neutral. It's not insensitivity on my part, it's just a kind of accepting where the preponderance of complaints will come from. So probably there needs to be required that there's an indication. Do I say, I don't like that, don't do it again? Do I communicate in some way to the person that I'm offended and that I don't want it to continue? How do I make that person know that the advance is unwelcome, is my challenge? Because if you don't do that, if there's not a way to communicate that, bearing in mind that there's a time period of 6 years in which you can make this complaint, and in certain circumstances, the tribunal can enlarge that time. If it's not communicated, then and then 6 years after the person raises it, to be very, very fair, the offender might not even recall that he had said something obnoxious and sexually suggestive. And I want to find, and it was a concern I had in the Joint Select Committee as well. I want to find a kind of balance. One of the things we had proposed, some of us had advocated for, was a shorter time period to make the complaint, so that at least it would be fresher in everybody's mind. But public sentiment on this matter was very, very strong. And the persons who made the presentations before us were very clear that they wanted the longest possible time. So we moved from the 12 months in the bill to actually going to 6 years with the possibility of enlargement. And I must say that we got new insights while we were discussing this matter. Because Senator Longmore brought to the Joint Select the feeling of the woman and the feeling of trauma and the lingering feeling that women have from these sort of experiences. And just recently, there was a report against a broadcaster, an anchor. And it was, Senator Brown, what? How many years ago? 30. It happened about 30 years ago. The complainant said she didn't think it was of a sexual nature. But what had happened is that I think he squeezed her bottom and said, no, I can do this, because the relationship had changed and she was no longer his employer. You want me to call his name? Now, the whole point of that is that it indicates a deep psychology behind these feelings and a sense of hurt and embarrassment which you can experience for many, many years. And so in striving to find a balance, which is a just balance, we who sat and deliberated on it, the preponderance of the arguments before us suggested that there was need for a very long time. And, Mr. President, I can say this, that in spite of the number of amendments which have come, there were 10 amendments in the other place, and there are amendments here which we have worked through. I know that a lot of thought, a lot of consideration, and a lot of deliberation went into the crafting of this legislation. It was a sincere effort to address the concerns that were raised. Is it perfect? Perhaps not.
Certainly not.
But the duty which we had, we exercised as carefully and as diligently as we could. The level of participation was high. And indeed, I would say that even in the media, there was a lot of discussion around this issue. On talk shows, in print media, in every sphere, there was a lot of discussion about it. Some people wanted us to even go further and asked us, what about catcalls? What about if you ride on a bus? And whereas we were sympathetic with the fact of how it feels for a man to come behind you while you're on a bus and rub against you, there were some logistical and evidential circumstances that could not be entertained in the legislation. The way in which the bill evolved by virtue of the inputs from the public, Mr. President, was significant. And if there's one thing that I am happy about, is that persons paid such close attention. I hope that it has instilled in them a sort of consciousness about how important it is to pay attention when matters are being done in this space, since it impacts them. And Mr. President, I promised myself not to make a long intervention, bearing in mind that I was part of this committee. But I just want to make 2 points. The bill provides for review after 2 years. I'm sorry, after 18 months. But the employer does have a time frame within which all the policies and everything must be put in place, and the employer has up to 12 months. Remember that this is in a way uncharted waters that we are venturing into. Whereas I said before, there are going to have to be some cultural shifts. So after the employer has everything in place, some time has to be given for us to see how really it works. We're going to want a tribunal to be established. We're going to want them to set up their rules and regulations. We're going to want to have some training that the employers do with persons, their HR persons, so that the HR persons can communicate what is in the policy. And I frankly think that 18 months for a review in these circumstances do not serve us well, and we need a longer time. Because our intention in the review is to correct or address or expand any clauses, which when we put it in operation, we see that it is just not workable. So I would like to ask that that be looked at again to see if the 18 months review is indeed feasible, having regard to the other provisions in the bill. I also must say, Mr. President, that I have a concern about the role and how the authorized officer functions under this legislation. The 1991 CARICOM bill had in fact provided for the authorized officer and had addressed his role. But instead of an authorized officer being permitted under the legislation to go in with a warrant and start taking documents, which I find very confrontational and hostile. This under the 1991 bill, if the authorized officer had reason to believe that a person was capable of furnishing information relevant to the investigation, the authorized officer could, by notice in writing, served on that person, require the person at such place and within such time as specified in the notice to furnish to the authorized officer by writing signed by the person such relevant information as is specified in the notice. And the CARICOM bill goes on to outline several of the instances which are actually addressed in our legislation, save and except that it does not have that, that clause about entering with a warrant in order to ascertain whether the provisions of Section 3 and 4 are being complied with. And it might be necessary for us to re-look at what Section 3 and Section 4 are dealing with. Because Section 3 and Section 4 essentially require that an employer make every reasonable effort to ensure that the workers employed by the employer are not sexually harassed in the course of their employment, and that any person who is in charge of an institution shall make every reasonable effort to ensure that the students, residents, wards, inmates, patients, or members, as the case may be, of that institution are not sexually harassed. 4 goes on to speak to the policy statement which must be issued, requires, defines puts the onus on the person in charge of the institution to carry out similar things as a person in the workplace. It does point to the policy statement required under this section shall be in accordance with the framework documents set out in the first schedule, and so on. So what I'm saying, the point that I'm trying to make by raising this is that it's really procedural things that he is required to. Are you complying? Do you have a policy in place? Have you done what you need to do to make sure that this can be effective? For example, do you have an HR person designated to do this? Have you carried out any training? What steps have you taken to communicate it that this is not acceptable, and so on? And I frankly think that that does not need that kind of intervention of a warrant to go in and seize documents. I far prefer the model which was in the CARICOM bill, where you send a notice in writing, request proof of these things, and it proceeds thereafter. Finally, Mr. President, in terms of the bill, the first schedule was not what I anticipated. It frankly was not what I anticipated when we were discussing it. I thought we would have had a policy which was clear, which was not open to debate, which did not lead to any element of confusion, and which any employer at whatever level could actually take up, understand it, and communicate it to the persons employed. Remember, Mr. President, this is not for big companies. We're not talking about companies with huge structures. We're talking about might be an employer who has 5 people.
Or 1.
Or 1. We're talking about a small business. We're not talking about, because you run a business doesn't mean that you have a particular level of intelligence. It means that you might be smart. But it doesn't mean that you necessarily can understand as complex a policy as this one here. And it's not what I expected, Mr. President. I will tell you. And since the legislation points to it and says that the policy statement must be in accordance with the framework document, it either needs to be looked at again or made clear that it's just a guide. But it can't be this that we're going to ask people to implement. In spite of the fact that I've said all these things, Mr. President, I considered it an honor to be part of this Joint Select Committee. I have often said in this chamber that at Joint Select Committees is when you see the best of parliamentarians.
I agree.
When you see parliamentarians who put aside any kind of partisan bias,
Absolutely.
and focus simply on the work at hand and crafting legislation which they consider to be the best and to meet the objective which is intended to do. As I said, persons who were present, who were part of this Joint Select Committee turned up. Not just turned up, but they participated. And I think that is noteworthy. The fact that we have amendments does not mean that not a significant kind of effort went into it. And more so, the effort to accommodate the views of the public. This is a very sensitive matter. People feel strongly about it. And the intention is to empower persons, men, Senator Crawford, and women, to come forward and to feel protected by the law. So, Mr. President, I support this legislation. And I hope that at the end of the day, the fact that it is almost historic in our country, that fact will be recognized. And I do hope that in spite of the cultural shift which is necessary, that it will be applauded in some quarters. Of course, we know we are going to need a lot of public education. And some people say that every time we do a bill, we say that a lot of public education is required. But in this instance, I think there will be an agreement that we have to find a way to communicate to employers, employees, persons in institutions, and generally to people what will be expected of them. If it pleases you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott Motley. Senator Campbell Rodriguez.
Mr. President, I'm just waiting on a stand because I can't see from so far, so it has to be a little higher for me.
Nobody was around here.
Thank you. Thanks. Mr. President, I stand here today and support the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act 2021. Today is but a few days short of the one-year anniversary of my being added to the Select Committee to consider and report on the bill before us today. Exactly 9 days short, but who is counting? It was often a marathon of meetings led by the Honourable Olivia Grange, Minister of Culture, Gender, Entertainment and Sport. There were times when the meetings felt long and hard, but we toiled not as JLP and PNP, but as members who knew we were working on something important for Jamaica and the people of this country. It was one of those committees that often left me drained, as we had to work through issues relating to not just sexual harassment of both men and women, but also having to take into consideration the impact that this seminal piece of work would have on our culture and way of being. Mr. President, I at times felt what I thought was guilt, because a large part of the Jamaican culture is wrapped in what is casually viewed as making women know say them look good, being casual and comfy with colleagues and friends. It took me a while to acknowledge with myself that I was not feeling guilt. Instead, I was fearful of the change. I was accepting of what had been taught to me consciously and subconsciously. I did not want to offend my male colleagues and friends and family members, and also women around me who maintained that what men wanted they should get. Women who believed that women forget look and man for look woman. But then, when I came to the realization of what was happening in my mind, I reminded myself that change is hard and it takes time, but it is necessary for societies to grow and to evolve. Mr. President, this bill may not be perfect, and rarely is there a bill that is, but we must move forward and ensure that in 18 months we review with an open and responsive mind. And my colleague, Senator, who just spoke, showed a little concern for the 18 months because of the fact that there's a one-year gap year when things are to be put in place. But 18 months gives us a time to actually work through what happened in that year. So I do support the 18 months for the review. Now, this bill has so many sections, and those of us who sat on the committee know we spent so much time debating, really with strong sentiments. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes highlighting some of them which I think need to be highlighted. Now, Mr. President, as good as this bill is, or the idea behind this bill, it is one that can be used to create mischief in the lives of innocent people. And that is why I am happy that Clause 41 was included. It states, a person who knowingly makes a false complaint under Section 27 commits an offence. A person who contravenes subsection 1 commits an offence and shall, on summary conviction in a parish court, be liable to a fine not exceeding $1 million, or in default of payment thereof, to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 3 years. To be honest, I was initially wary that this clause would discourage persons coming forward for fear that their complaint may be deemed mischievous and false. But then I recognized the importance of being balanced and to protect the innocent who may be falsely accused. Now, Mr. President, it is my hope that this bill and its future successful implementation will give both men and women a chance to breathe easier in the workplace, knowing that if by chance there exists sexual harassment against him or her, there's a remedy in law available to punish the perpetrator. Mr. President, I know it is difficult for some in the society to accept that sexual harassment is real. For some, the idea that them commenting on a woman's toned legs at least 3 times per week is sexual harassment, if she does not want the attention, is nothing short of ludicrous in their minds. But that is why this piece of legislation is so important. You as an individual may be comfortable with what you and your ancestors have been doing for generations, but that does not make it right. It makes it easy and comfortable. Women, and to a lesser extent men, are tired of giving fake smiles and uncomfortable chuckles. Some men are tired of pretending they like being treated as meat. We now have the support through this legislation to state that we are uncomfortable with sexual advances. It is important to know that in Clause 2 of the bill, sexual harassment is defined as meaning that the making of any unwelcome sexual advance towards a person by another person. It is important to point out that it is advances which are unwelcome. So let us say, for example, Senator Hill says something to me, and I respond saying I do not appreciate that. But he says the same thing to Senator Golding, and she does not mind. It's a different thing altogether. For me, it would be harassment. For her, it would not be. And that's what I think Senator Scott Motley was talking about. It is subjective. But those of us who find the advances unwelcome, we also have a responsibility to indicate that we do find that advance unwelcome. And that's what the legislation rests on. The fact that it's unwelcome sexual advances towards a person by another person. Clause 27(2) is another section of this bill which I need to highlight, Mr. President. And it was dealt with before in terms of the time frame. nearly every submission that was made to the committee, and of all the committees I sit on, I think this is the one that received the most input from the public. So there was wide consultation, and the issue of the time frame within which persons had to report the matter for it to be considered was widely debated, but nearly every submission dealt with it to some extent. And it would be remiss of the committee to go against what the majority, by a large margin of submissions, asked for a longer time. Because, Mr. President, victims of sexual harassment, as is the case with sexual abuse, often need time to process what has happened to them. Time is needed to mentally process the hurt, grief, and sometimes shame that accompanies the violation. Many women who have refused having their windscreen wiped at the corner of Devon House can tell you of the violation that can follow, with her tongue being licked across her windscreen while she scrambles to ensure that no further violation takes place from the offender's eyes. I know it sets while this bill does not handle sexual harassment on the street, I know it sets the stage for what will be a condemnation against all forms of sexual harassment, which will need to be legislated against in the near future. Women and men should not be sexually harassed every time they stop at certain stoplights in Jamaica. Sexual harassment is often a power play, a way to diminish an individual, to put them in their place. Not always, but often. Sadly, it can be a subconscious power play, and in the case of Jamaica, it is so deeply rooted in our culture that the subconsciousness of the power play is buried way below where the mind extends. Mr. President, let us use an example of Trevor, who lives in an inner-city community of Jamaica, where what or who a man is defined by popular songs and what the culture sees fit. Trevor works in a wholesale downtown as the man who packs the shelves. Trevor does not subscribe to the inappropriate touching of women by either groping or what is considered playful slapping, or even telling to a woman that she's yummy and scrumptious. Marcia, who is the supervisor in the same wholesale and is from the same community, would love for Trevor to relate to her in even a slight way. Trevor, Mr. President, is a faced man and dresses well, and should in Marcia's mind be yum-yumming at her if he's a real man. When he does not, Marcia decides to take the matter in her own hands and inappropriately flirts with Trevor, her subordinate, who asks her to refrain from the throaty phone calls to his phone, inviting him to do things which it would be inappropriate for me to mention in this chamber. With the passage of this bill, Trevor will have the option to refuse and report Marcia's behavior if she does not desist when he asks her to do so. He can report the matter to the owner or manager of the wholesale, who in turn must follow a procedure to ensure that the work environment for Trevor is no longer filled with dread at being sexually harassed. Let us, Mr. President, not be fooled, though, that just by passing this bill into law, that all will be well. There will be need for a massive public campaign, akin to the "Two is better than too many" campaign from the National Family Planning Board decades ago, or the Jamaica Moves campaign in recent years. If the law is simply passed and the public is not educated about behaviors that have gone unchecked for generations, we in this Parliament are doing an injustice to the people who we have been elected or selected to serve. Without a successfully implemented campaign, Trevor will likely be taunted and emotionally demolished for refusing Marcia's harassment, because real man no refuse nothing. I can already hear in my mind's ear what Trevor would endure if we do not ensure that the thought process of Jamaicans change as it relates to accepting that sexual harassment is real and hurtful and unnecessary. Mr. President, we need TV ads and discussions on social media and radio stations promoting the importance of preventing sexual harassment and protecting those of us who have ever been sexually harassed. How many women have cried tears because they are torn between letting a colleague know their behavior is inappropriate or smiling sheepishly for fear of repercussions or being viewed as aloof? On the passing of this bill into law and the education of the public, Jamaicans of either gender will have some protection. No one will need to feel desperate because they once again have missed a month's rent and know that the landlord will respond with a twinkle in the eye and a solution that demeans. Clause 11, 2D takes care of this problem. Mr. President, we know that women across the world are disproportionately affected by sexual harassment. This is a fact. And if that makes this a bill that is gender biased, personally, I am okay. But the facts and the numbers reflect the fact that more women are affected than men. Women across different socioeconomic classes and educational levels live with a feeling of feeling dirty, feeling guilty, and being disgusted. Some of us fight back if we're the confrontational type. Some of us remain silent to prevent problems and to keep the peace. For our boys and men, sexual harassment comes with the added baggage of being considered a mama man for not wanting to be haggled sexually. This bill, it is hoped, will normalize the idea that times and thoughts have changed. No one should be made to feel harassed in a sexual manner within any place of work, any educational or health facility, or any place in this island. Mr. President, I will share a quote from the last chapter of Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. She's talking about a case of sexual harassment and says, women endure entire lifetimes of these indignities in the form of catcalls, groping, assault, and oppression. These things injure us. They sap our strength. Some of the cuts are so small they're barely visible. Others are huge and gaping, leaving scars that never heal. Either way, they accumulate. We carry them everywhere, to and from school and work, at home while raising our children, at our places of worship, anytime we try to advance. End of quote. In closing, Mr. President, I will share a post I saw this morning when I opened Facebook. An Australian friend of mine who currently lives in Belgium made the following post. To the men who felt the need to drag their pudgy little bodies carrying their bears to follow me around the corner as I ran past their watering hole at lunchtime today, commenting on my tits, I despise you. You are everything that makes me scared of the world my daughter is still growing up in. This body of mine is nearly 42. My boobs have fed 3 kids and seen far, far better days, and it's mine. Yet you still think you have a right to look at me and pass comment. No doubt you thought you were giving me compliments, flattering me, that I'd be grateful for your attention, or maybe you didn't think at all, you just behaved the way you wanted to, knowing you could. I gave you the finger as I run by, as your eyes went up and down all over me, and then I felt fear for acting out, wondering what you would do, so I ran faster. Maybe one day I'll be brave enough not to run faster, but to stop, look you in the eye, and ask you why you think you have any right to treat me that way. For now, though, I'll keep running. What happened to my friend did not happen in a workplace, but it outlines what is a sentiment felt by many persons who have been harassed. Mr. President, we are tired, and we would like to put down this burden of sexual harassment. This bill is a first step here in Jamaica. Let us allow it to bring about the changes that are needed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Campbell Rodriguez. Senator Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. President. I guarantee, sir, I'll be very careful in speaking on such a touchy topic. However, I colleague said the word touchy shouldn't be used in such a sensitive topic. Yes, from now. And I am going to be speaking as it relates to what is becoming more and more accepted, that different economic activities must be treated in different ways or should be given consideration for treatment in different ways. And in particular here, I'm speaking to the economic activity of a service as versus a primary or secondary manufacturing or farming activity. There are certain nuances of a service, and there's also great dependence of the Jamaican society on a service that I believe calls for special consideration and different treatment of a service. I must admit that I have not yet in my mind concluded if it should be harsh, more harsh, or less harsh, but there are differences that I seek to highlight. One of the realities of a service is what they term inseparability, Senator Hill, and inseparability suggests that the consumer must be present in accessing the service and in receiving that service. So some people call it simultaneous consumption and production. So that reality calls for the consumer to be almost a part of the production of the service, as versus in a manufacturing entity where the consumer isn't necessarily a part of the service. It might be confused to say, oh, when they're buying it, they are now consuming a part of the service portion of that activity. And so the treatment of a service as it relates to the customer control, the control of the employer over the customer, must be given consideration because the customer must be present and must interact within that space and that activity. So what we're saying, Senator, is that if you look at a hotel, and I'm speaking now because tourism contribution, tourism employment, and tourism is one of the biggest employers of women in our society. In fact, tourism disproportionately employs women. It has been proven within this society. Senator Rodriguez, I highlighted that the mindset of our society, and not just Jamaica as a society, because when we invite people, their mindset also comes to interface within our society. The mindset of society is a tourist, is that they're coming for the sun, the sand, the sea, and for some, also sex. Some research have shown that that sex portion isn't necessarily with the natives, but sex with themselves. Many come as couples, wives, etc. But also some expect, and this in this case is not only women, and I want to make it very clear to the men of this society that this bill is not only for the females. The reality is that more female may perceive sexual advances as an harassment, but I'm not sure of the research that says sexual advances is disproportionately male, especially nowadays. Quite a few times some people jump in my DMs and they're females, but it is less likely for a male to perceive an advance based on how we're cultured as harassment. And it might be more likely for a female to perceive an advance as an harassment. So therefore, let us not assume that there is a big gap and variation in the advances. But how it is perceived may be different because how we are cultured.
Right. Absolutely.
So we have to accept that. Now, what one must be careful is that the reciprocation of the advance then be perceived as an harassment. As I was discussing that with Senator Scott Matley this morning, that you may go further than it was anticipated in your reciprocation. And you have to be very careful. Like you might then say, me did think that because she said baby, I could send her a photo. That is further than she had expected. And so, to get back to the point I was making, is that the service environment, which has both the employee under control and the consumer constant interaction, that the consumer's behavior is less under the control of the employer. And so therefore one must perceive, or one must, what's the right word? Perceive is not the right word. One must analyze, how do we treat the duty of care and responsibility over the consumer, in this case like a hotel guest. How do we treat that? And how do we ensure that there is satisfactory, Sophia, may I lose the word when you're seeking redress? Satisfactory redress. Now, let us look at a circumstance. Senator Leader of Government Business. A visitor comes for 4 days. There's a complaint on the 3rd that based on our perception, I was harassed. How is that handled when the visitor leaves on the 4th day? And what is the redress to the person that feels that they were harassed? Is it now the duty of the firm who accommodated that visitor? Or is there a strategy and method for the person no longer in our shores to answer to the claim? How would that be treated? Now, go further. If multiple individuals suggest that an environment was created conducive to harassment within the firm. So an environment is created that a visitor feels that he can participate quite freely in an harassing behavior. How would we treat that firm, even though the clients are not present within the space and cannot be a part of the proceedings? The other important point that Senator Rodriguez brought up is the reality of variability, another characteristic of a service. She said that in one circumstance, an advance, in this case by Senator Hill, would be frowned upon as harassment, and in another case, an advance by the same Senator Hill would have been welcomed as a compliment. Now, this creates in my mind an area of uncertainty that I don't see treated in this bill. It seems to me that on initial engagement, a person can be perceived to be harassing without having been advised that it is unwelcome. So therefore, I feel that there must be some consideration for knowledge. Now, of course, you're going to have a level of harassment that you're going to say, yo, this never need, you never need no initial. But a wink may be perceived as an harassment from person A, and a wink may be perceived greeted with a smile from person B. It is, in my opinion, that having winked and been told the wink is unappreciated, that the next wink should then be perceived to be knowingly so. Because what we have seen in this bill, it is that perception is the basis, but perception from one side, the receiver, and not considering intent from the sender. So if I wink to say, oh, we have a good local plan, and I did actually, and I got a smile from over that side, so I'm going to assume that. I got multiple responses, sir. Now, if I wink and my intent was not of a sexual nature, should that be perceived as sexual harassment. The bill says, as is perceived, but makes no room for as is intended. And even Senator Rodriguez made a very good point of an example of harassment at the stoplight. But is it automatically sexual harassment because the gender is opposite? Because if I'm at the same stoplight and the person does the same action, but is harassment, but is it sexual because him spit upon my car windscreen? I'm saying we must be careful that harassment like an email isn't into sexual harassment automatically. That calling your phone without making no advance sexually is not said, don't call me and you're harassing me, and now saying that you're sexually harassing me because I called your phone. Now, that variability happens every day in services. What is greeted with a smile today may be greeted with a frown by the same person, interacting with the same person tomorrow, based only on just their mental state tomorrow. What is greeted by one customer as lovely service may be greeted by a second customer as unwelcome service. And what is greeted by one guest interaction staff as welcome and funny may be greeted by another interaction staff as negative. So when there's no intervening consideration of information transferred of my dissatisfaction, it creates a great avenue of risk that I think we should consider greatly. So what I said to my team this morning is that there must be consideration, especially for the service industry, about how the customer is to be treated. What is the control over the customer, and what is the duty of care with how the customer acts. The second thing is how the entity is to be treated, because the entity can create a conducive and encouraging environment for harassment. But the inability, the short-term usage of the quote-unquote likely harasser cause for little actions to be taken because the entity isn't sufficiently held responsible, in my opinion, for creating these things. And I believe one of the necessary reasons, one of the reasons this is necessary as a bill is because of that abuse of power, that power structure that exists. You gave a poem that says you do it because you know you can. Within our service industry, the need for a job, the limited alternatives for a job has caused for many of our persons employed within these service entities to accept these advances because the power structure that exists. And so I believe maybe we have to either be more harsh from that entity perspective, that it must be clear, and that avenue, that environment should not be created. And so I believe that we have to look at the services more, because the service worker is at risk for being harassed and at risk for being perceived to be a harasser because of the necessary interface between them, other staff, and customers, but also because of the multiple variations that exist, human to human interaction. And so what is habitual of a bartender in how they serve a person may be perceived as harassment without any mediating circumstance of information being given. So I am not particularly happy that without being informed, especially for the slighter activities as to a call, a wink, or whatever. Of course, a slap, a touch is too far. And clear permission should be sought. But the simple activities like saying you're looking good today, which I did this morning to Senator Golden, and I maintain that she's looking quite lovely today. And I told her before we even started to debate. No, she welcomed my advance, she welcomed when I said she was looking nice, but Senator Arbin was refused. But but I'm saying, if she informed me that, Senator Crawford, I would prefer if you don't compliment my dress code, because on the days that you don't say anything, I kind of feel like I'm not looking as good as the days that you do. Then if she does that, the next time I do it, I have now committed an offense to her. But if she has never done that, the first time I do it, when I've done it to Senator Longmore every day and she accepts it, and I say, oh, yes, the ladies over that side, they like when I compliment them. No, I thought she did, I'm sorry. but I love calling it. I like seeing when you smile, Senator Longmore. But I think it's getting there. But in more seriousness, sir, you can see how easily the variability between interactions with person A and person B may cause a first interaction with an unknown person to be incorrectly perceived and not communicated, can cause for great harm and distress on the part of the other individuals. Some women and some others would say, just don't do it, just don't do it, just don't do it. Just don't compliment a person. Just don't say hi to a person. Just don't wink to a person, because our natural inclination is to carry to the more egregious ones, Senator Bunting, of saying, yeah, just don't touch the person's breast. Correct, don't touch the person's breast. Yes, just don't spank her on her bottom. Yes, just don't spank her on her bottom. Just don't say something crass and rude like, yo, you forget this and you forget that. Yes, don't do that. But this bill carried much further into some very simple activities that variability can cause. So because the service firms are afflicted by that variability, also afflicted by the inability to capture all interfaces as versus with the non-service firm where you know exactly where the interface is going to be. Also because of the inseparability and the customer's important contribution to the production of the activity, I feel that we should give special consideration to service firms as versus non-service firms. And to that extent, sir, that is why I wanted to make my short intervention that services may need a special conversation. With that, I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crawford. I like your blue suit, by the way.
No, sir.
Senator Longmore.
Thank you, President. I rise in fulsome support of this bill in front of us today. Not because it is perfect, but because it is very well needed. And for me as a mental health practitioner, it is long overdue. Mr. President, I sat on the Joint Select Committee, and as has been reflected by Senator Scott Motley, there were moments of pride as we all deliberated some very complex issues. and we recognize how very critical this bill is to our society, considering some of the cultural norms that we all engage and experience. But, Mr. President, for me, it is a moment of triumph as we recognize and put on our books a bill that primarily focuses on the psychological damage that can be done from another person's action on towards another. It is not just the physical harm. And I bring this to our fore because these more serious crimes that we might deal with and grapple in our society, they start somewhere. They start with little ripples and little actions that go unanswered and little actions that are not requiring justice. And these tend to build on bigger and more damaging behavior. So for me, not a perfect bill as yet. And Senator Scott Motley, I remember our discussions around the review time, etc., etc. And I think that we should look at it that 18 months reflects the administration's concern and recognition that this is a critical bill, that there will be issues within the society to grapple with, and maybe a very early review process is what might be needed to eventually come to something that is more fulsome and applicable to all the needs of our society. So I'm good with the 18 months. There was reflection for me whilst we were in the committee stage, and I will just highlight one or two of those clauses that were very critical for me. One being 27.2.1, where the time limit for reports was being discussed. And we have settled on 6 years and 1 year, 12 months for some categories of offenses. But I want us to recognize, and yes, there's a provision for even extended time, considering with certain circumstances being considered. But I want us to reflect on why we had to extend this time. It is because the effect of this experience sometimes does not manifest immediately, sometimes does not impact immediately. Sometimes because of the circumstances that the victims are under, they in the moment cannot and do not feel empowered enough to actually make the report. So I am very grateful, and we have certain elements of it, as Senator Rodriguez mentioned, and yourself, Senator Scott Motley, in terms of the public education arm to enable persons to utilize this bill to their best extent. That is one area that I think that we definitely need to focus on in our public education efforts. Another area is Clause 41 and the false complaints. I am particularly happy that we have this, because I do hear the concern of an abuse of the authorities that may be enabled in this bill by the victim. And we must protect against persons who will use it as a tool to victimize others. And so that clause and the penalties, I think it is $1 million that was quoted, for false complaints, intentional false complaints, I think is one that we also should definitely pay attention to. Now, the review process, there were one or two issues that I raised that I had concerns of at the committee stage. And I know that it might be a little bit controversial, but the age of consent for me, though not mentioned in this bill, but the little gap of where a child is defined as below 18 years and under, and the age of consent being 16. I think that gap between 16 and 18 years old, where a young man or a quote-unquote potential perpetrator who may think that he is within the remits of a somewhat adult interaction or adult exchange with a 16, 17, 18-year-old is permissible. But if it is done against the definition of a child, the offense can easily be escalated to an assault or a criminal matter. And for me, the age of consent, we solve this issue by elevating the age of consent. I know that's a different debate, but that gap, I think, for those of us, especially the males in our society, who may not be fully aware, there is an avenue for where they may fall victim. Mr. President, just to reflect a little bit on the importance of this bill in another context, in terms of the intrinsic value of self within our society. We are grappling with all sorts of issues that result from a lack of that intrinsic value of self and self-respect that is given to another person. And it is very critical for me that we start with where, if you have an issue, Senator Crawford, your concerns, if you really read the details and the description of and the definition of sexual harassment and sexual advance, it is clearly laid out that it is such that is regarded as offensive, humiliating. It interferes with work performance. It is creating an intimidating and offensive and hostile work environment. And it must be of a sexual nature. So a compliment, and it is reason, a person with reason will recognize it as being such offense, in such offense. So it is not just giving a compliment and limiting and restricting that type of exchange between persons. But what we are seeking to do and giving voice to persons who normally would be voiceless is that you're enabling someone to say, I don't like this, and I have a right not to like it. And especially if it is in a repeated manner, there is now an opportunity for an action to be brought against it. And especially in our workplaces where persons are supposed to be productive and have a particular objective in mind, it is particularly critical. Now, in that context, a lot of Jamaicans and a lot of persons are concerned about harassment in the public space. And I would hope that upon the review process that is going to happen in 18 months, we probably will be moving towards some recognition of how we can address harassment in the public space. Senator Campbell Rodriguez mentioned about the street, on the streets and being harassed by wipers on the for her windscreen and so forth. But we know of the cases in the taxis. We know of the cases on the buses. We know of the cases going past the construction sites. And this is not just for women. It happens for men too. So we anticipate and we hope that that early review process will see us reflecting on these occurrences. And so, Mr. President, I don't plan to be long. It is many persons have spoken, and like I said, I've sat on the Joint Select. But I just want to reiterate that this is a great step towards enhancing the value of self, enhancing conflict resolution, and stemming what starts as a ripple that can become even more greater issues in our society. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Longmore.
Mr. President.
1 minute, Senator Fraser-Binns. Thank you, Senator Longmore.
Oh, no.
Okay, it's okay. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you, Senator Fraser-Binns.
Thank you, Mr. President. I see Maria looking at me almost in shock because
he asked me earlier if I'm going to speak, and I'm like, I'm really not so sure at all. But I could not help, Mr. President, to really stand and make what I deem to be very brief, yes, Senator Gale, very brief comments on this bill, because it is such an important bill. Mr. President, girl, the way you look good, me have to ball out. Look like you're born with a spoon in your mouth. Did it hurt when you fall from heaven, angel? Brown skin. What I want to wrap around my hand, brown skin. And I cited these, Mr. President, because over the years, these are the things to which women in particular have been subjected to. Whether it is on the street side, in the bus park, or even in the office space, these are the things that we have been subjected to. And it is in recognition of the fact, not so much about giving a compliment, but the fact that so many of the persons who are intended to be complimented are offended, that I believe that this bill is being debated here today. And this recognition, and whereas I give congratulations to the minister and her team, this recognition predates 2020. Because in 2016, former Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller opened the debate on the sexual harassment bill in the lower house to successfully pass, and former Minister of Justice Mark Golden opened it in the Senate, but the debate was closed due to the prorogation of Parliament. And I say that because one of the things that we can agree to is that the issue of sexual harassment knows no color. It knows no political alignment. What it knows is that persons are offended and there is not sufficient legislation, or there's an absence of legislation to make that redress. Now, Mr. President, I am particularly pleased with this legislation because, and Senator Scott Martin spoke about the Joint Select Committee and the benefits of it, and I too want to agree, because Senator Natalie Rodriguez, I'm not sure if this was your first Joint Select Committee, but you would agree that we learned so much more from the interaction with the persons who presented than what was contained in this legislation. It caused us as parliamentarians to get over the unease that we may feel in dealing with certain issues and understand the angst that presenters and the organizations they represent feel, and force us to come to a decision on how to make a piece of legislation that best deal with these issues that are faced by males and females. And so I'm very happy about it. One of the things that, and you know, the good thing about the Joint Select Committee is that, and I'm not sure, yes, it was before COVID, it was during COVID, and a statement was made by one of the members, and that caused a lot of public, I'm going to call it public relations. But the good thing about it is that it drew the attention of the country to what was being debated. Because from that point, I believe that almost every single Jamaican stopped and said, what? Sexual harassment? What is that? And they would tune in because they want to hear what is being discussed. And I think that is a good thing. But what I have realized is that a lot of persons still do not understand that this piece of legislation is very specific in how it's treated sexual harassment. So, for example, it deals with sexual harassment in the workplace. So we need to understand that it is not sexual harassment carte blanche. It deals with sexual harassment in the workplace. So if an employee feels that he or her is harassed by the employer, then it deals with this piece of legislation, and vice versa, because the employer can also be harassed. can also be harassed. It deals with sexual harassment in institutions such as our schools, our universities. And that is something that we need to talk about, because so many times we hear students on campuses that talk about their experience and the lack of adequate redress. What I particularly like about this legislation is that it's gender neutral, and Senator Crawford stepped out. It's gender neutral. And perhaps his theory is correct, I don't know. But what I know from the information available to me is that women are generally more impacted or are generally the victims of sexual harassment than males. But notwithstanding that, this piece of legislation says whether you're a male or you're a female, if you feel that there is unwanted sexual advances, then you have redress in this piece of through this piece of legislation. And that is something that I want to commend. I'm particularly happy, Senator Longmore, that in the Joint Select Committee, the psychological effect on the individual was discussed at length. At one point, we wondered if we were doing a course. I mean, you see something on campus, you know, and Senator Longmore was our lecturer. We wondered. But it was so good that we had the benefit of that knowledge and that information, because there became an understanding by not just the members of the committee and the technical team, but by those listening, about the psychological effect that sexual harassment has on persons. And, you know, I do recall sharing my own experience of when I worked in another institution, where a lady came to us and confessed that she was molested, and after 40 years, because she was medicated, she was able to speak about it. And Senator Longmore, I believe you were in that committee meeting when you said that is what happened. Because persons are so traumatized that they repress it, and years later, they're able to talk about it. And I believe that the absence of counseling over the years has not helped, and with the provision that, or the mandate that in this piece of legislation, whether through the tribunal or the workplace, that individuals will have counseling, I think is going to be helpful. The issue of sexual harassment, and I think I understand where Senator Crawford was going with this, because it is such a personal thing. It is subjective. And I may not have a problem with someone saying something to me, but certainly Senator Scott Motley may find it very offensive. And the fact that I do not have a problem with it does not make it right for Senator Scott Motley. And so there are two things that I addressed my mind to throughout the whole consultation. Was one, that this subjectiveness that it offers is not abused. And I believe that all of us were cognizant of that and very much aware that the possibility for abuse does take place, or well, can happen, which is why there's a provision at Section 40 that ensures that if somebody dare to go about and spread untruth or fabricate an experience against another, then they will be dealt with, and dealt with severely. And this is something real. In my other vacation, I had an example of a young man who came to me because there was a hearing against him in his office that he sexually harassed an employee, his staff. And when he came to me about the matter, he was beside himself. And that matter dragged on for almost 3 years before it could be resolved. And I can only tell you that during those 3 years, he was traumatized, he was affected, his work was impacted. At the end of the 3 years, the matter was resolved clearly in his favor. And he never ever became the same person. He just did not. He was so impacted that, you know, something as simple as when he travels, he would take back chocolate for his staff. He just stopped. Something as simple as that. And we have got to be very careful that persons do not fall or do not take advantage of this provision. The other thing that came to mind in looking at this provision was a need for ongoing public education, because it is very easy for one to say, oh no, we have a sexual harassment act, so we can do X or Y. Public education is going to be important, and I know that the legislation speaks about workplace having their sexual harassment manual and having their education, because it's important that staff members are made aware of what is sexual harassment, what is deemed sexual advancement, so that they are clear in their minds, so that if and when that situation occurs, there is no doubt and it can be addressed. Mr. President, the issue of the review period, and I share the concern with Senator Scott Motley about the time frame, and particularly because, not only because it will not give persons sufficient time to really understand or experience the working of the legislation, but because the fact of the matter is that there are so many pieces of legislation we have now that are due for review that we just have not done. We continue to legislate a review time in almost every legislation that comes into this House. And regrettably, we have failed to observe those review periods. I'm hoping that we will show our commitment to the Sexual Harassment Bill, Sexual Harassment Act, by ensuring that on the 18th month, we start the process to review. And I say that, not to cast any blame, but remember the Road Traffic Act and the rush to pass the Road Traffic Act. And to date, it is still not in effect. I mean, there are so many examples that one can cite, and I'm just praying that this does not fall into that category, and we will show our commitment to it by ensuring it is reviewed at the right time. And in closing, Mr. President, I cannot but express my own gratitude to the entire team. I mean, being a member of the committee, but there's one individual who I believe must be commended, apart from the minister and her commitment to it, but Ms. Robinson. She was at every meeting, she answered all the questions, she provided the information, and I know she is not a one-man team, but I really want to use the opportunity, Minister Johnson-Smith, to commend her for the work that she has done, not just in relation to this bill, but what she has been doing at the Bureau, and wish for her and her team continued success. I know that the work has just started, and I pray, Minister, that all the resources that will be required to give this act its full effect will be made available. And with that, Mr. President, I thank you, and those are my very brief comments. Senator Gale? It was brief, right?
Thank you very much, Senator Fraser-Binns. Senator Allen, Senator Allen, I'm going to take you after Mr. Gale, I believe. Mr. Bunting? I'm just giving you a heads up.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator Gale, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. President, I want to start by expressing gratitude for being part of the Joint Select Committee. And for me, it was a great experience. We started out maskless, then we wore masks, then we went virtual. We started out with a bill that made provisions for the prevention of sexual harassment and connected matters, and it moved to sexual harassment for the protection and prevention. We also went through a number of deliberations, 40 odd, I believe. One of the things that was good, and Senator Scott Martley made a reference to it, was the fact that the collaborative approach, there was no opposition against government. It was an approach that appeared inclusive in nature. I want to also commend the technical team that gave you much support and service. They came under extreme pressure from the members of this committee. And there were numerous occasions when they came and made representation, and we sent them back to do further research. And I want to use the opportunity to commend them for the work that they have done. President, the bill is cited as being gender neutral, but the committee was not gender balanced. And so sometimes I felt almost alone. I felt alone. But President, this is a very critical legislation. Some would say that they like it, and some has expressed a dislike. Some would say that it has gone too far, and you have others who would have expressed it has not gone far enough. The important thing is that we have a legislation. We have a legislation that is dealing with sexual harassment that is a negative effect on the working environment. It undermines gender equality. It creates an unfair practice in employment. And it has adverse impact on the dignity and the well-being of not only workers, but those in institutions and those who seek accommodation. And so, it tried to reach the widest spectrum. The legislation is aimed to help employers, agencies, organizations, and companies and workers to develop their own policy and regulations to integrate what is being proposed in this legislation to shape their own policies. But there's a guide. I say that, President, because being a trade unionist, I'm an advocate that is going to represent the alleged victim on the one hand, and also the alleged perpetrator. And in the absence of some guided principles, we have challenges. My own experience, I have a relative who he was sexually harassed in the budding part of his career. He worked for a large financial organization, but came under pressure from his manager, who wanted interactions outside of the workplace, and the probing and pinching and the encouragement and the demand. No, it was a woman.
Good question.
The issue, though, is that it came to the climatic stage of his performance assessment. And I use that term carefully. No pun intended. But the result of it was that he was on a fixed-term contract, and notwithstanding the fact that he was an excellent worker, admired by his peers and the customers that he served, for whatever reason, the fixed-term contract was not renewed. There was no legislation to protect him. In another organization, I had a member who for 4 years, she suffered under advancement and harassment and the intimidation. When she decided to speak out, the effect of that, the result of that speaking out, she was transferred to another department. Nothing was done to the manager who was the perpetrator. And we had challenges treating with it, but today we're going to have a legislation to protect such persons. I reviewed a case in South Africa where 2 employees working in a bank from Johannesburg, they both flew to Brussels for a conference. And the first night when they landed, Thursday night, the male invited her, let's have dinner. We're in a far country. She refused. The Friday night, he again invited her, and she declined. The Saturday night, they had a function, and he wanted to sit beside her, and she went elsewhere. The Monday, when they resumed work, she filed a claim for sexual harassment. Luckily, in that country, you had a legislation. There are procedures, and when the investigations went through, but you found that in the final analysis, the claim was false. The point I'm making is that in all these circumstances, we must have some sort of guideline, some sort of protection to support any such claim, to give the rise to an investigation and for a procedure so defined, so clear in treating with it. Because, President, this piece of legislation, it has to be dealt with practical experience, but there has to be certain guidelines. And I want to re-emphasize the point that sexual harassment is defined as any behavior of a sexual nature that affects the dignity of both women and men, which is considered to be unwanted, unacceptable, inappropriate, and offensive to the recipient. And that creates an intimidating, hostile, unstable, or offensive work environment. Now, how many persons would have gone through this and have to suffer under what would be considered hostile, unstable, and offensive work environment? For years you go through this, you don't know what is going to happen because there would have been no avenue, no channel to treat with it. Nobody to speak to. No redress. And so that's why it's important for us to have this piece of legislation in place that creates that avenue. President, this harassment, it must be understood that it's not going to take place in the confines of the building, the place you work. But also it is understood that if you go to conferences and training sessions and business travel, maybe if you go to lunch or you go to drink, it also assumes that it takes place virtually or remotely by the text messages, the WhatsApp messages, the telephone conversations, whatever means, it takes that into consideration. President, the key, and I was glad when the bill defined the worker means a person who carries out work in any capacity for an employer, and it includes an employee whether in the private or
Mr. President, the time being 1:20 p.m., be quiet over there. I ask that the Senate be allowed to sit beyond 1:30 p.m. to complete the business of the day.
Thank you, Senator Hill. You would have heard the question, members. Those in favor? Aye. Against?
Thank you, President. It includes the domestic worker. It includes a person engaged under a contract for service or a subcontractor of that person. It also includes an employer of a person or subcontractor referred to in Clause C. And so it includes a person whose services is procured or arranged by a company which is in the business of supplying workers or other business. So it speaks of the outsourced service. It also went further by including the apprentice, a trainee, or an intern, a student gaining work experience, and even a volunteer. So it's which will widen ambit to protect all that would be viewed as being workers. President, Clause 5, for me again, is another important clause. The procedure for lodging sexual harassment claim and the duty of the employer. And so where a worker alleges that he or she has been sexually harassed by another worker or a client, that worker may lodge a sexual harassment claim in writing with the employer. But it demands that the employer has a duty and an obligation to effectively respond. And it also says in 5.3, an employer who fails to take the required action under subsection 2 shall be liable for the failure to act, and a worker who is aggrieved by the failure of the employer so to act make a complaint in respect therefore to the tribunal. What this does, President, is that it prompts an action, that the employer don't hear about the complaint, believe it's frivolous, and does nothing about it. And so it triggers the inspiration of confidence in the legislation that these matters must be treated with as a matter of urgency. President, another area, and this is one that, had a lot of debate, and it invited even submissions from those stakeholders who represented. And I want to again commend those persons who took the time out, those organizations, and I believe even one single sole individual made a representation. It was good. But in Clause 9, sexual harassment by an employer, supervisor, or co-worker. And Clause 9.1, an employer or supervisor shall not harass a worker. 9.2, an employer or supervisor shall not make it appear to a worker that the prospects of working conditions of that worker are contingent upon the worker's acceptance or tolerance of sexual advances from the employer or supervisor. And B, the worker will suffer any form of disadvantage in connection with employment unless the worker accepts or is tolerant of the sexual advances from the employer or the supervisor. So this is saying that you must never suffer You must never feel intimidated. You must never feel as if you have to accept sexual advances or sexual harassment. It went on in the other sub-clause to define and distinctly explain that a worker shall not sexually harass a co-worker. You know, there was a debate whether or not the worker can harass the supervisor or the manager. And the debate even led to, if a claim was made, if the manager could dismiss the worker. And then you have the other tribunal treating with that matter. One of the critical areas for me in this, and Senator Crawford, who has left, spoke about the hotel industry and what the expectations that a tourist or a visitor or a guest will come for. But we made it quite clear in the legislation that a client shall not sexually harass a worker. We made it quite clear. And we also believed as a committee that there has to be actions taken. Now, he made reference to the fact that what happened if that tourist left? The important point is that there must be a commitment in policy for organization to stand up against sexual harassment in the workplace. Whether it be from co-worker to co-worker, whether it be from manager to employee, but it also should include a resistance to any worker feeling harassed from a client or anybody who provides any type of service. President, so we would have established a tribunal, and there was heavy debate around the composition of the tribunal, what the role and functions of the tribunal would be. The important thing is that there is a tribunal, and the tribunal has a responsibility to make certain awards. I was a little concerned about what would have been contained in terms of 36(1)(c) that gave that tribunal to make such other award as may be appropriate in relation to the complaint. Giving that tribunal that wide gamut. We're starting with a legislation another critical area, President, clause 40. A person commits an offense if that person here subjects or threatens the subject, another person, to any adverse action. We have seen situations where persons would have raised a report, raise a concern, indicate that, raise a complaint, and they would have been terminated. They would have been demoted. They would have been transferred. Those are adverse action against some individual who would have raised a complaint. And it's very important, President, that this legislation creates a provision that provides a protection against any such adverse effect. President, in the course of this, I remember being asked, Senator Fraser-Binns made reference to the fact that this was one legislation that had attracted a lot of attention. Persons in the society even to the extent where they demanded certain things that should be included in the legislation which could not be accommodated. Because there is a feeling and there's a sentiment that around acts of intimidation and what is clearly unacceptable in terms of sexual misconduct in this country. And not only the country, but the world itself. And those who share the concern demanded that we must treat with the behavior. It may very well mean, President, that we may have to look at other legislations that makes provision against sexual offenses. But when someone asks the question, is it sexual harassment if someone I used to date at work won't leave me alone? Now imagine Senator Lambert Brown.
Thank you.
Used to date Senator Fraser-Binns. I'm addressing through you to Senator Brown.
That's impossible. Senator Fraser-Binns is far too young to have been considered.
And they used to date. They stopped dating.
Impossible.
Maybe if I'd used you, they would have believed. They stopped dating.
Stop.
That's why I stopped getting in the deep water.
And the behavior, the tendencies continued. It would have been viewed as unacceptable, inappropriate if the recipient is against it. And notwithstanding the fact that they used to date, the relationship ended. And we came across a situation, President, where in reviewing a particular complaint, the alleged perpetrator indicated, but we used to date. I used to pay your rent. I gave you all the lavish gifts. The fact of the matter is that it is unwarranted, it is unwanted, it is inappropriate, it is unacceptable, and so it is sexual harassment. Full stop. And President, these are questions that we're going to have to deal with. But I agree and support the point that the fact of the matter is this piece of legislation is going to require a serious change in behavior. And so there has to be an intense education campaign, not only public, but in organizations and in institutions, in order to ensure that there is the protection and prevention. And I want to express a disappointment because the last report in the public domain about the status of this legislation, one print media referred to it as the sex bill. That is unfortunate. If we are going to educate, if we are going to properly inform, then do the right thing in being precise in the communication. We're very clear if we are sending a mandate, if we are clearly defining the objective of this legislation, let it be said, let it be understood, President, that is the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act, not the sex bill. I do know what is a sex bill. So, President, the bill, as I've indicated, It may not have gone to the extent where persons are desirable. It may have gone too far based on the opinion of some. It is not liked or it is loved. I agree with the fact, however, that the act shall be reviewed from time to time by a committee of both houses of Parliament, and that the first such review is within 18 months. And I try to jog my memory, because I believed we started out with a 5-year and we went down to 3. And I tried to jog my memory, but I found out why we had gone down to 18 months. 18 months, there was so much debate in this around this piece of legislation, and still areas that has not been addressed. Areas that were worthy of further concern, but because of the policy direction, and if we had incorporated some of those well-intended recommendations, it may have shifted the entire bill. And so, the compromise, President, was let's review in 18 months. Let's review in 18 months. For the person who I met on the day I was changing my battery, and he said to me, "Now you are the man who had changed the sexual harassment, bring in the sexual harassment legislation." And I had to explain about the legislation itself. And in Clause 41, a person who knowingly makes a false complaint under Section 27 commits an offense. Because there's a reason, President, there's a feeling, what would happen if someone makes a false complaint? And it tarnishes or stains, you're drenched with the stain of what is left of that false complaint. And that's critical. And I would want to say to persons, look, do not exploit this legislation. It was intended for a clear purpose to prevent and to protect and to create remedies in procedures to treat with sexual harassment. It must not be used as a tool of exploitation. And that is why I'm glad for the insertion of Clause 41. So, President, it's an important piece of legislation. We have not have gone to the extent where persons are desirable, but it's a start. And we hope that it is properly utilized. May it please you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Gale. Senator Bunting, I'd asked if Senator Allen was going to speak, but I was just making sure the thing was working. Is she going to speak now, Senator Allen?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Senator Gale. Members, I ask you to recognize the speaker on the video platform, Senator Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. President and colleagues, for this opportunity to speak in this fashion, which feels a little odd, but I'll do my best not to be slightly thrown off by the fact that I'm not interacting with everybody in this space. So thank you very much. The reality is that this bill is without question extremely important and serious. And it focuses on, as we've mentioned and heard many persons mention before, and based on what's outlined in the memorandum of article of objects and reasons, the fact is that it is focused on sexual harassment in the workplace. And 2 weeks ago, the leader of government business made mention or used a particular example that stood out for me, where she mentioned the 19-year-old young woman with 3 siblings working in a space and situation of being responsible for taking care of members of her family, and having been sexually harassed and being traumatized by the experience, and the fact is, in being in need of money, caused her to be in a very vulnerable place. Many times when we think of sexual harassment in the workplace, we think so quickly of someone who sounds like the description given in that example. And in fact, this morning, Senator Campbell Rodriguez used another example that it was very easy to recognize. I decided to speak today because I thought it was important to add to the discussion, although I'm certain that during the deliberations by the Joint Select Committee, there were various examples that were put forward because of the strong input by members of the public, various organizations and individuals. But I wanted to also put within where we are now in this space in the record, the fact that sexual harassment in the workplace, I too have had my own experience and unpleasant experience. In fact, some years ago, whilst working in a government organization, I remember one day wearing a pair of pants that was commented on in a way by a colleague of mine, in such a way that I felt so uncomfortable that I never for about 15 or 20 years wore a similar color pants ever again. And it was very easy for me to think that, did I wear the wrong color? Is it too tight? What did I do? As opposed to just recognizing for what it was worth, the fact is that he was inappropriate, was wrong, and harassed me. I mention it because so very often in the workplace, we see those types of things happen. And it's very easy to say, as we're discussing now, that the victim or the alleged victim should say something and make a record of it and make a formal complaint. But sometimes things are a little bit easier said than done. And as a matter of fact, Senator Gale just spoke about attending conferences and meetings outside of the walls of the four walls of the workspace. And sometimes there are examples of even you stand for a group picture and somebody's a little bit cheeky. It happens. And so for that reason and for those reasons and many other reasons, it is important that this bill gets the support that it deserves. And the work that has been undertaken by the committee, we've all heard when it started back with the introduction by former Prime Minister Portia Simpson-Miller, and the work by the technical team and all who are involved and have been involved in the process. It is important that we certainly commend them for their work and thank them for what has been done so far. Senator Scott Motley made mention earlier that, and I'm sure it is shared by many, that the work that is being done at this time with this bill is the start of critical work to be done, because we're in a place, we're in a country where a cultural shift is necessary in order that we can really get to a place where this is not even a matter for discussion anymore. It is so ingrained in who we are and what we are that the references and the examples used by Senator Sophia Fraser-Binns earlier in terms of how our music, sometimes the expression of that culture in our music and in so many other ways, the hope is that the work being done and what is being intended by this bill, that it will cause for shifts to take place beyond the workplace, because it is so needed. So many women continue to be impacted by these experiences that it has become almost the norm, to the point where complaining doesn't seem like the first option. I wanted to continue on a reference made by Senator Crawford with respect to the tourism industry, the service industry. And I agree with him that there's going to be a need, or there might be a need, to have even special focus there. And it is not to say that what is being done now is expected to be the answer to everything, but just to put in our minds the importance or the need to pay attention to certain areas based on their own nature and how things operate in those spaces. Pre-COVID, the industry directly employed about 170,000 people in Jamaica. The majority of them in accommodations, and the majority of that number being women. And it is true that we have all heard the statistics cited that in most instances, women are the ones who tend to face this unfortunate reality. And so, because of that, many operators in the industry have had to pay close attention and put in place policies that aid in this effort to reduce, to eliminate the incidences of sexual harassment in the workplace and in those workplaces. It means, therefore, that the work that is going to be done by the Ministry of Gender, which has responsibility for the oversight of the implementation of the various policies that are to go along with this bill and to be implemented by various employers, it is going to be critical and probably even a stretch. And therefore, it is going to be necessary for collaboration to see what is already in place by these institutions, these operators of mainly accommodations, what they have in place, and how that works well in tandem with what is being proposed in this bill. I say all of that to say that in the initial 12-month period of the implementation process, there might be, I am anticipating or expecting that the review that is going to take place will require looking at what already exists, because within the tourism industry, we have had no choice but to be very strong in this regard, especially as we look at incidences and cases that have been reported, and some have gone unreported, of client-worker situation of sexual harassment. Many have been addressed and addressed locally, and some have not been addressed because the visitor or visitors have left. And it goes both ways. And so the collaboration between the Ministry of Gender and with the entities that already have done so much work in this area is going to be important. But I anticipate that, of course, that will in fact be taking place. I made a few notes here, but I think in terms of the oversight to be given by the ministry, as I said before, I am probably a little concerned. I don't know if it is justified, but I'm a little concerned whether they will be called upon to do so much more, and whether there must be some avenues to incorporate other ministries or agencies, because I don't know what the size of the cadre of people who will be responsible for the oversight. And so that is the point that I would raise. And I know this is something that we discussed on our side, and there are others who have more to add to that matter. In general, I am obviously supportive of this bill. It is not perfect and it may not address everything at this point. And the work that has been done by the Joint Select Committee must be commended. It is my hope that this starting point, or where we are today, how we have culminated to this point based on all the work that has been done over the years, that it will begin to cause the cultural shift, because in our Jamaica, it is so ingrained in the minds of many that this is so natural that those who are perceived victims do not even see it as an issue. And those who are perceived perpetrators, they themselves do not see it as an issue. So I look forward to the day when this bill would have begun the process to cause those attitudes to be changed in order that we can truly be the Jamaica that we all want to or will see as a place to live, to work, and to raise families in a safe space and safe way. Thank you, Mr. President and colleagues.
Thank you very much, Senator Allen. Senator Golden.
Can I get that? Thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I need space. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to join my colleagues in the Senate on congratulating Minister Grange and her team for addressing the issue of sexual harassment and the work that they have done in bringing this bill before us. And I also recognize former Prime Minister, Most Honorable Portia Simpson Miller, for the work that she did in her time in recognizing that this was an issue we needed to look at and to complete. We are now here, and I think the importance of the bill has been remarked on, experiences shared, and from the female perspective, I want to remind us too, and I think Senator Gale alluded to it, that there are experiences that our male citizens and young people can also share. The important part about this bill for me is that it really does seek to approach the issue from a gender-neutral perspective. And that, again, underscores the point that this is not just about females. It's also about the protection of male complainants from the experiences that they have to engage in a workplace scenario. It is, I agree, and it has been recognized, a cultural shift in how men and women interact. And I have to say this, Mr. President, I don't know that I necessarily look forward to a world where Senator Crawford can't wink at me and I can't wink back. But I do recognize that where we have to look at the scenario of unwelcome sexual advances, that a cultural shift and the discussion that would have to ensue to have that happen may not necessarily be a bad thing. I have, male peers and friends who will tell you, certainly I know my husband will testify, that I always say, I'm not a talk and touch girl. If you're talking to me, you don't have to touch me. You don't have to rest your hand on my shoulder. You don't have to rest your hand on my knee. Just talk. Use your words. And I have had occasion in recent times to advise male clients that they must just talk without resting their hand on my knee or resting their hand on my arm, my forearms, just not appropriate. So the extent that we have moved in a way, I certainly feel so, in a situation where how we engage as men and women, oftentimes I find borders on inappropriate. When I listen to my grandparents describe how men and women interacted, certainly in the 30s and 40s when they were young people, it's so vastly different from how we engage now. And the standards of decency and what is appropriate are miles apart. Even so from my father's generation, which is just the last 70 years. But I recognize when I look at my children that how they're engaging is very different from how I engaged. And I've had occasion to say to my son, when you're talking to a lady, you don't have to be up in her face. Step back, give 3 to 4 feet distance. Give her the space to feel that she's not in a threatening place with you. But his sensitivity, of course, is his generation, and it is different. So I make that point to say it's not necessarily a bad time for us to start talking about how really ought we to be engaging, not just in the workplace, but generally in the society. And so, to the extent that this bill, as has been recognized, will require some serious public education and nationwide discussion, I certainly, Mr. President, welcome that. And I as you talk about the nationwide discussion, Senator Gale, you mentioned the article in the papers, the September 18th article, in fact, and I must share with the Senate that I did write to that particular newspaper, indicating to them my discontent with how that headline was placed over the article. And if I might be permitted, Mr. President, I will quote from my letter. This offensive headline belittles the very issue the bill seeks to address and is a perfect example of the disregard and insensitivity that women and men who are victims of sexual abuse and harassment typically encounter. I went on to say that the importance of the bill in that article had been minimized by the offensive and careless headline that was used to describe it. I must tell you, Mr. President, I think my office sent that letter to the news editor and the actual editor, and I don't think it had the courtesy, even today, of a response. That was the Jamaica Observer, sir. But, Mr. President, notwithstanding the importance of the bill, there are some aspects of the bill as it is now drafted that I do believe require us to take a deeper look. And I'm just going to outline a couple of my concerns. Some of them have been mentioned before. I want to draw the attention of the Senate to the definition of institution, and I have been having some discussions with the technical team about how to address it, because I do understand that there is a commitment to look at this further and to take on board the suggestions as to how to best close some of the gaps. In the definition of institution, in clause 2, institution applies to a school under a college, university, and other place of learning or training. It therefore means, Mr. President, that a school, a high school, is an institution. And further, if you look at Clause 2, subsection 4, the provisions of the bill are being made to apply, well, the provisions of the bill do not apply to a person under the age of 16 years old, which means that it applies to a 16-year-old, 17-year-old who would not be considered adults under the law, who are students at that institution. And here's my concern, Mr. President, as the mother of a teenage high schooler and stepmother of another teenage high schooler, both boys. It's a time when young persons find themselves learning, boys and girls, how to engage with each other. They make mistakes, they offend each other. But this engagement is happening in a space that I consider to be a guided environment. It's a school scenario where school administrators and guidance counselors and teachers are accustomed to having to intervene in these kinds of engagements, simply because it's teenage time, hormones are busting, and how do we guide them and teach them how to talk to each other and how to relate to each other? It seems to me, Mr. President, that in that kind of scenario, to subject that 16 and 17-year-old in a school scenario to the provisions of this bill may not be the most advised policy position. I'm not sure if that was really where we intended to go, but I think that's where we are. And part of my concern is because in that period, teenagers, as I know them, I don't necessarily remember this, but as I watch my two boys, the engagements sometimes are very vicious and vitriolic. When they don't like each other, Senator Longmore is nodding. When they don't like each other, or when they have a beef with each other, they can often do things that are very detrimental to the other. And then, of course, parents and administrators get involved. I've had occasion to counsel my boys and say, look, when you see another child who is being bullied or, being treated in a particular way, your job is to find out what's going on with him, because something is wrong. Don't be a part of the crowd that is attacking. But that's what teenagers seem to get up to until they are guided out of that kind of response. And so I'm concerned of the vulnerability of this bill in relation to false complaints of a 16 and 17-year-old in a school scenario, particularly because although Senator Gale, Section 41 provides for an offense where a false complaint is made, that complaint, that provision is only applicable to a complaint made to the tribunal. So until the complaint moves from the school internal mechanism to a complaint of the tribunal, the recourse for that young person, be that young person male or female, in a scenario where they have been falsely accused under this bill, does not provide them with any kind of punishment for someone who has falsely accused them. And I'm concerned about that because I fear they more so than adults are unlikely to be aggressive in seeking redress. I think also of the nature of the school community across the length and breadth of Jamaica and the ability of those young people to get support if they have been falsely accused, where this matter does not get complained to at the tribunal level, and it sort of sits in that institutional framework. It's something that I have raised with the technical team, and I have asked them to take a look at it. I think there's an intention to do so. Mr. President, I raise another point in relation to Clause 3 and 4 of the bill. Clause 3 and 4 dealing with the obligations of an employer to seek to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. 3 being the requirement, the obligation to make every reasonable effort to ensure that it doesn't happen. And 4, to issue a policy statement in writing. Again, I think I've heard other speakers raise the issue. I've raised it in this context, Mr. President. The breadth of the breadth of the provision, because every employer, as was recognized, the minimum standard for that is an employer of just one worker. Just one worker. I am not clear. I'm not clear that it even indicates the time that that person must be employed. So, in fact, I don't think it does. So, a domestic scenario, of course, is captured. Any employer with one staff member is captured, and they are then required to deal with this policy, to issue a policy statement. I won't repeat what has already been said in relation to the onerous nature of that. But I will ask that a look be taken at what is the penalty if the employer fails to do this. And that penalty begins at Section 15, where, I apologize, Section 12, with the authorized officer. The amendments that have been tabled provide that an authorized officer may, in relation to the exercise of the functions of the authorized officer, under subsection 1A, 1, with a warrant, enter any place of employment or institution in order to ascertain whether sections 3 and 4 are being complied with. Section 3 being the obligation to make a reasonable effort, section 4 being the obligation to issue a statement. That's really concerning to me, Mr. President. And the devil is in the details. And I want to make it very clear. I support what this bill is trying to do. But I think we have to drill down a little bit more into some of these details. That means that on complaint, I am assuming, because it doesn't necessarily say so, an authorized officer will go and obtain a warrant. But I'm not clear who issues that warrant to them. Is it a judge? Is it a JP? Is it a senior officer in the police force? I'm not clear what they must establish to the person issuing the warrant to determine that the issuance of the warrant is a reasonable thing to do. So that, how do you establish satisfactorily that I have failed to issue this written statement? Because somebody has said so, that's it? How do you establish satisfactorily that I have not made reasonable effort to provide you with the level of suspicion you would need to issue the warrant? So, respectfully, I'm going to ask that we take a better look at that. It's so fundamental to me because the only little space I have that I can exclude the world from is my home. And when I am in there, I don't want to know that an authorized officer, not a police officer, not for a criminal offense, is able to secure a warrant to enter my little tiny place that is the only place I have that I can exclude Senator Brown from. So I appreciatedly, we share different homes. So I would commend that to the team and ask that a deeper look be taken at that, both from a policy perspective, but also in terms of setting out the law and looking at how we are going to secure that warrant for the purpose that we are seeking to secure it. It's of concern. Mr. President, my final point, well, it's not really a point, I guess my final comment. As I said, I have 3 children of my own, 2 stepchildren, and I, as a mother, support the intent of this bill. As a legislator, as a Jamaican citizen, I know that we have not been able to really see the kind of data in relation to how these things happen in our society, but everybody knows that it is happening. I like data. I see it in my own practice. I see it in the public service. I have been a part of a number of administrative panels in the quasi-judicial setting of disciplinary proceedings in the public service that come to the panel on a claim of sexual harassment. At the moment, some organizations have a policy and some do not. And therefore, some of those complainants are successful in relation to the person who they've complained against, but it's a disciplinary setting. So sometimes you can't establish that it has happened because there's really no policy. And of course, with the absence of the law, there's no legal basis. So I do think it's important, and I think we need to have something in place. The Minister, I understand, has committed to looking at the issues raised today and seeking to remedy them at a later date. Minister Grange, I will hold you to that. I will hold you to that promise, and I commit myself to the process of supporting any engagement in relation to making this a better bill. We need our best selves and our best minds. I'm happy. I'm actually feeling very positive today that unusually so, or maybe not, maybe those are not the words, not frequently enough, both sides of this Senate appear to be embracing something in the interest of Jamaica. Thank you, my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Senator Morris. Senator Morris, I sent a note to Senator Golden. In keeping with the policy that I indicated prior to today, I'm going to take a half-an-hour recess to allow the staff to refresh themselves. So this Honourable Senate will now rise until 2:45.